Welcome to Dicta, your weekly dose of law school and bar exam info. I'm Carrie Ann.
And I'm Puyan, and we're the co-founders of Vinco. So today what we're going to be discussing is another one of my favorite topics, class notes.
You have a lot of favorite topics. Did you really like all these things this much in law school?
No, I'm being completely sarcastic. Class notes, briefing, outlining are just, they give me trauma when I think back.
That's pretty standard. So not only are we talking about class notes, but we're talking about effective note-taking tips.
Right,
and
yeah.
what are you supposed to be getting out of your class? So we developed 4 tips and then a bonus tip, which you'll have to stay tuned till the end to hear. So our first tip is about black letter law. So what is black letter law?
Well, okay, so my take of black letter law is the rule. It's the rule of the case.
Right.
This
isn't a trick question.
In simple terms, without any specifics from the case. And
right, no facts.
I just wanted to add that this section that we're going to be discussing, class notes, typically refers to the class after you've briefed the case. So you have the case brief. Yeah,
so the tool you're walking into the class with is your case brief and whatever other notes you may have, and then your professor is reviewing those things in class. Yeah.
Exactly.
So the first thing you should be listening for are things related to the black letter law, meaning the rule. So how do you know if that's what your professor's talking about? This is a pretty easy one. They might say, this is the black letter law.
Or this is the rule.
Or this is the rule. Or they might start giving you elements.
Yeah.
Or they might say what factors the court relied on.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a bunch of tricky ways that professors can get the rule out there. So you want to be listening for things other than black letter law.
And be careful. If they're talking about the factors they relied on, the professor may be talking a little bit about like the reasoning and analysis. Yeah. So just pay close attention.
When I say factors in that sense, I mean, was there a 4-factor test or a 4-element test? The word test is also a good one to look out for. What
red
test
flags
did the court rely on? So anytime you hear one of those buzzwords, you know they're talking about the law, and that's a really important thing for you to be getting correct. So you want to write that down in your class notes.
Definitely.
Pretty good advice there.
Yep. So something else that you should really be paying attention for is when one of your professors is constantly repeating something during a class. That typically means that they're going to be testing you on that.
Or that it's important, right? If they have a special way of saying something or a special term or an acronym, anything that they give you over and over again that they repeat, you're going to want to put that in your class notes because typically they're not going to focus on something that isn't that important to them.
And if an idea can be phrased in several different ways, as is often the case throughout law school, and your professor is phrasing it one specific way, that's how you want to phrase it and just spit it back to them that way during the exam.
Exactly. That's really good tips. I often have students come to me and I use a word that they said, what? My professor doesn't use that. And I said, forget I said it. What word does your professor use?
Exactly.
Because it is the test according to your professor. It is the law according to your professor. You can be right till you're blue in the face, till the cows come home, but if it's not what they think is right, it's not right. So if they are phrasing things in a particular way, as Priyan said, you want to make sure that you are taking note of that so that you can give those words right back to them on the final exam.
Exactly. So what happens, I have a specific question. So I would constantly walk into class with my brief, and I was really confident I killed this brief. I read the case 3 times. I didn't start really marking the case up until my second read through, and I really understand it. The reasoning was kind of roundabout, but I think I got it. I found a bunch of supplemental materials that were not in my textbook, and I really understand what's going on. And then I get into class, and then the professor just completely goes with a different reasoning and oftentimes a different rule of law, and it turns out I completely missed it, or according to the professor I missed it. So what do you do?
Well, I would start with a couple of deep breaths because it sounds like we're going on a downward spiral of panic here. So it happens to everyone. It will happen to you. It'll probably happen more than once. So that's part of the process. Understanding that that's part of the process is an important first step. But that is the perfect thing that you should be taking notes on, because it's clearing up your understanding of the law, right? And maybe we should have started with this, but that's the whole point. The whole point of taking notes is to make sure you understand what's going on in the class, what the law is, how the cases factor in, and as a tool to start your exam preparation, right? Briefing and class notes are the first steps in exam prep. So yeah, if you've had something incorrect in your brief or different from what your professor
Right.
said, that is perfect place to take a note and say, okay, I had this, my professor elaborated on it, or she changed it in some way, or it was just totally wrong, and I'm going to take that out of my notes
Yeah.
completely and add in the thing that was correct. So that's a really big area to listen for, and that's why briefing before class is really helpful, and you shouldn't necessarily abandon ship on it even in your second and third years. I can't, the professor in me has to say, keep briefing, please keep briefing. So the fourth tip that we have is, we save the best for last, right? So if your professor tells you to write it down, write it down. And I know it seems like, why, crazy lady, are you telling me this? But I have students who I say, write this down, I write it on the board, right? Those two things are sort of go hand in hand. If they write it on the board, if they say, this is important, if they say, write this down.
Or if they repeat it,
right.
like, the same thing.
Same thing, right? But like really flashing lights, this
Yeah.
is something I want you to know, and I'm not trying to hide the ball here. So if your professor is giving you this clear signal that it's something they want you to take away from the class, write it down. So if they tell you to write it down, if they write it on the board, or if they say something like, this is important, or this will be on the test, those are the kinds of things that definitely want to make it into your class notes.
Exactly. I remember in my first year, I was briefing cases while I was preparing for my outlines. And my outline consisted of a series of briefs, which I later refined and worked with. But what my outlines did not include was what the professor specifically emphasized in the class.
Yeah.
And that often made a big impact on my final grades, because you know, it was the same thing as me not going to class at all.
They want to see that you showed up for their class all semester. And I will say this again, it is the law and the class according to your professor,
Right.
which is why in another video I talk about how it could be dangerous to study with students outside of your section because their professor might be using other terms,
Absolutely.
other phrases. It's not, it's not a definite no-go, but there's things that you need to look out for because it's a class according to your professor.
Exactly.
So to summarize those 4 tips, you want to write down anything that sounds like the black letter law or the rule, and you want to listen for the different signal words that your professor could be using. The second thing is anytime your professor is repeating something or placing emphasis on it over and over again, to make sure that makes it into your notes. Anything that contradicts your brief or expands on your brief or your understanding in some way is the third thing to look out for. And number 4, the obvious one, if your professor is telling you to write it down,
You should ignore it completely.
or that it's important, you should ignore him completely, then you should write it down. If your professor wants you to know this and they are telling you they want you to know it, make sure it makes it into your notes. So I actually have a bonus tip today.
Oh boy.
Because note-taking isn't just about what you do in the classroom. It's about what you do with those notes afterwards. So did you have any process in place for dealing with your notes after class or before the next class or what? Tell me.
No,
Share with the class.
I should have, and I regretted it every semester. But toward the end of my law school experience, I would go through and make sure, in addition to briefing each case and refining my briefs, I would go through each page of class notes and make sure during class, I would put stars next to anything important. So I would go back.
So you had developed a system.
Exactly. It was my star system. And then I would go into my final outline for the class, and I would just add the stars to my outline. And it often made it like twice as long because I've refined it so much by that point that adding entire sentences from my notes, my class notes, extended my outline drastically. But that was extremely important information, and that's stuff you shouldn't abridge.
Yeah. So there are people who are way smarter than me, who know way more about this than I do, who talk about the different kinds of repetition and learning that can really make things stick in your brain. I was recently at a conference where another professor was sharing this information, and it was so interesting to me because I didn't know this. This information would have been a total game changer to me as a law student, that it's not about cramming to get it into your head.
Right.
It's about chunking things off into like topics that you can come back to and review and come back to and review and come back to and review. So it's about breaking down this whole process, and instead of, you know, saving everything till you start outlining later in the semester, when actually once you finish a topic, come back to all those notes. Maybe you're talking about 2 or 3 classes worth, see how they make sense, see how they work together, see what's important about them, and then come back to them again during your outlining process.
Exactly. If I could have done one thing differently throughout law school, it would have been at the end of each week, I would have compiled, broken down my briefs into a semi-rough draft of an outline and put the class notes into it, injected it. And that would have saved me so much time at the end of the semester.
And there's also another important goal here, right? You're trying to make sure that you understand this information for your final exams. But if this is also a bar tested subject, you want to make sure that it's not completely gone from your brain by the time the bar comes. Sure, you will do your review, but you want to have a foundation. And the studies have shown that the repetition when you're first learning it helps with retention for down the line. So there's more than one reason to do this kind of review.
Yeah, and Carrie Ann's method really helps form the information in chunks that make sense for you, and that will help you retain it. So when you go to study for Crim Pro during the bar exam, a lot of that information's already been broken down. You're not going to be relying on your outlines from law school because you're going to be taking like a bar review course.
Right.
But the foundation will be there, and the neural pathways will already have been formed.
Yeah.
All you have to do is reinforce them.
You have to bring them back to the top, right?
Yeah. What's it called? Memory.
It's like your memory muscle. Yeah. What's it called? Memory. Well, okay. So as per usual, we've gone sort of slightly off track, but we hope that these tips will help you get more out of your classes and help you focus on what's really important. If you have any questions for us, we can be reached at carrieann@vancoprep.com, and we will see you next week.